On a Sunday morning in July of 1993, the Des Moines River broke through its banks south of Saylorville Dam, and 250,000 people in Iowa's capital city lost their drinking water. The water treatment plant was underwater. Fire hydrants ran dry. National Guard trucks rolled through neighborhoods, handing out jugs of bottled water to families who had been brushing their teeth with Coca-Cola for 3 days. Across the state, from Davenport to Council Bluffs, every river was doing the same thing. Every levee was failing. Every drainage ditch that had been engineered to move water off the land was now doing something no engineer had planned for. It was moving water onto the land faster than anyone had ever seen. The tile drainage system that covered north-central Iowa was, by 1993, the most sophisticated water management network in American agriculture. It had taken more than 100 years to build. It had cost collectively billions of dollars. And it was the reason Iowa had become the most productive farmland on Earth. To understand what happened in 1993, you need to understand tile drainage, the machine that built the Corn Belt. Beneath nearly every cornfield in the upper Midwest ran a network of perforated clay and plastic pipes, 4 inches in diameter, buried 3 to 4 feet underground, spaced 30 to 50 feet apart. They collected excess water from the root zone and channeled it by gravity into drainage ditches that fed into creeks that fed into rivers. A single farm might have 15 miles of tile line beneath its fields. Installation cost ranged from $400 to $800 per acre in the 1960s, roughly $3,500 to $7,000 per acre in 1993 dollars when you factored in replacement and maintenance. The system worked beautifully in normal years. It lowered the water table. It dried the soil faster in spring, letting farmers plant earlier. It reduced compaction. It turned land that had once been too wet to walk on into land that could grow 150 bushels of corn per acre. But in 1993, the system did something nobody had designed it to do. On the first week, when 6 inches of rain fell across Kossuth County in 4 days, the tile lines handled it. Water moved through the pipes, into the ditches, into the East Fork of the Des Moines River. The system was working. On the second week, when another 5 inches fell on ground that was already saturated, the tile lines began to back up. Water couldn't drain because the ditches were full. The ditches were full because the creeks were full. The creeks were full because the river was full. The river was full because every tile line in every county upstream was pumping water into it at the same time. On the third week, the system reversed. Water didn't flow out of the fields through the tiles. Water flowed into the fields through the tiles. The drainage network that had been engineered to dry the land was now flooding it from below. Between April and August of 1993, East Central Iowa received 48 inches of rain, more than a full year's precipitation in 5 months. 15 million acres of farmland across 9 states went underwater. 75 towns were completely submerged. Damages exceeded $15 billion. More than 50 people died. The Army Corps of Engineers estimated that nearly all 700 privately built agricultural levees along the Missouri River were overtopped or destroyed. A hydrologist from Iowa State stood on the Channel 8 News and said something that nobody in agriculture wanted to hear. "We engineered the water off the land for 100 years," he said. "We just never asked where it would all go at once." That's when a rusted 1978 Ford F-150 with a cracked windshield and a faded Kossuth County Fair bumper sticker, pulled up to the edge of County Road B63 and stopped. The driver got out, walked to the shoulder, and looked south across the flattest landscape in America. To his left, his neighbor's 400-acre cornfield was under 18 inches of brown water. The corn was shoulder-high and drowning. To his right, his own fields, 285 acres of corn and soybeans, were wet but draining. Between them sat 35 acres of cattails, sedgegrass, and shallow open water that everyone in the township called Earl's Swamp. Let me tell you about Earl Dietrich, because you need to understand the man before you can understand what he didn't do. Earl Dietrich was 72 years old and had farmed 320 acres in Kossuth County, Iowa, for 44 years. He had come home from Korea in 1952, married a woman named June who could fix a screen door and balance a checkbook on the same afternoon, and taken over his father's farm the year Eisenhower was elected. Earl was not a man who went to meetings. He was not a man who attended the co-op seminars on yield optimization or the extension office workshops on modern drainage techniques. He was a man who walked his fence line every morning before dawn, watched where the water sat after a rain, and remembered what it did 10 years ago, and 20 years ago, and 30 years ago. He had never borrowed $1 in his life. He paid cash for seed. He paid cash for diesel. He paid cash for the used John Deere 4020 he bought in 1974 and was still running in 1993. His neighbors financed $200,000 combines. Earl's combine was a 1979 John Deere 6600 he had rebuilt twice with parts from a salvage yard in Fort Dodge. And in the middle of his 320 acres, he had 35 acres that he refused to drain. Earl's father, Walter Dietrich, had homesteaded the land in 1923. He had paid $38 per acre, $12,160 for the whole 320. The year that Calvin Coolidge moved into the White House, and the price of corn was 68 cents a bushel. Walter had fought the land for 2 years before he understood it. The 35 acres in the low quarter of the property were prairie pothole wetland, shallow depressions carved by the Wisconsin Glacier 10,000 years ago, filled with snowmelt and rain, thick with cattails and sedge, and the kind of black muck that stained your boots for a week. In some places within the Des Moines lobe, the glacial formation that shaped north-central Iowa, there had been as many as 200 potholes per square mile, a landscape more water than land. Let me tell you about that wetland, because it's the real hero of this story. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't beautiful in any way that would make a calendar. It was 35 acres of shallow water, rarely deeper than 3 feet, surrounded by a fringe of bulrushes and dotted with the nests of red-winged blackbirds. It smelled like mud and decomposing vegetation. It attracted mosquitoes in June and froze solid in January. It could not be plowed, planted, or harvested. By every measure that modern agriculture used to evaluate land, it was worthless. The soil beneath it was Okoboji silty clay loam, black as coffee, dense with 10,000 years of decomposed root material, capable of holding water the way a wool blanket holds warmth. The cattails that grew from it sent roots 2 feet deep into the muck. The sedgegrass along the fringe wove a mat so thick that a man could walk on it without sinking if he stepped carefully. Beneath all of that, the glacial till formed a natural bowl. impermeable clay that kept the water from draining straight down into the aquifer. It was, in every way that mattered, a bathtub that nature had built and spent 10,000 years lining with the most absorbent material on Earth. But Walter Dietrich had noticed something in the spring of 1936, the year the Dust Bowl reached its peak and the thermometer in Algona hit 111 degrees. While his neighbors' fields flooded after every heavy rain and then baked dry within a week, his fields drained more slowly and held moisture longer. The water from the upland slopes didn't rush across his property into the drainage ditch. It pooled in the low 35 acres, sat there, and seeped out gradually through the soil over weeks. "The water wants a place to rest," Walter had told Earl when Earl was 14. "You give it a place to rest. It won't tear your house down looking for one." When the USDA began its cost-share drainage program in the late 1950s, every farmer in the township signed up. The government would pay up to half the cost of installing tile drainage. County agents drove from farm to farm with topographic maps and drainage plans. Between the mid-1950s and mid-1970s, 500,000 acres of wetland per year were drained across the United States. Iowa lost 90 to 95% of its original 4 million acres of prairie wetland. The drainage was considered conservation. The USDA classified it as an approved agricultural practice. Every farmer in Kossuth County drained their potholes. Every farmer except Earl Dietrich. The county agent came out in 1963. He brought maps. He brought cost estimates. He showed Earl that draining the 35 acres would give him 35 more acres of corn ground, at a time when corn was $1.12 a bushel, and 35 acres could mean an extra $5,000 a year. Earl listened. He looked at the maps. He walked the agent to his truck. "My daddy said the water needs a place to rest," Earl said. "I believe him." The agent wrote in his file, "Landowner declined, non-participating." Dale Pfeiffer was the most vocal critic. Dale was 42 years old in 1968, a Kossuth County extension agent with a degree from Iowa State and a genuine belief that modern drainage technology could lift every farmer in the county out of the mud and into prosperity. He wasn't a bad man. He was a man who trusted the science of his time, and the science of his time said that wetlands were wasted land. "Earl Dietrich is farming around a swamp when he could be farming through it," Dale announced at the Algona Co-op winter meeting in January of 1968. "The government is offering to pay half the cost of putting that ground into production, and Earl's sitting on 35 acres of duck pond because his daddy told him to. That's not farming. That's a museum exhibit." The crowd laughed. Someone in the back said, "Somebody call the Audubon Society. Earl's running a bird sanctuary." The name came from Hank Schroeder, who farmed the section east of Earl's place. "Mud duck," Hank said one morning at the feed store. "Earl's a mud duck. He'd rather watch the mallards land than watch the corn grow." The name stuck. Within a month, everyone at the Algona Farm and Fleet knew about Mud Duck Dietrich and his 35-acre swamp. Within a year, it had become a running joke at the co-op, at the county fair livestock barn, at the Methodist church parking lot after Sunday service. Earl didn't respond. He didn't defend himself. He didn't try to explain what his father had taught him or what he had observed for 40 years about the way water moved across his land. He hadn't complained when Dale called his wetland a museum exhibit. He hadn't complained when Hank coined the name mud duck. He hadn't even complained when the county assessor valued his 35 acres at $12 per acre, less than a tenth of what drained cropland was worth, and sent him a notice suggesting he consider improving the property. He just drove home in his truck, walked the fence line the next morning, and watched the red-winged blackbirds settle into the cattails the way they had settled every spring since before anyone in Kossuth County had been born. Now, let me pause here and ask you something. Have you ever kept something that everyone told you was useless? Not because you could prove it was valuable, not because you had data or studies or expert opinions on your side, but because something in you said it was wrong to let it go. Have you ever held on to a piece of land, a habit, a way of doing things that your father or your grandfather taught you, knowing that the world had moved on, knowing that the smart money said you were a fool, but keeping it anyway because the quiet voice in your chest was louder than the loud voices in the room? Have you ever sat in a room full of people who were laughing at you and said nothing because you knew that the only answer that mattered was the one that time would give? Earl Dietrich had that certainty. He had it the way a man has a scar, not because he chose it, but because he had lived through the thing that made it. He had watched water for 44 years. He had watched where it went when it rained hard, and where it went when it rained soft, and where it sat when the snow melted in March. He didn't need a study. He had a memory. "Earl, I'm not trying to argue with you," Dale Pfeiffer had said in the spring of 1971, standing at the edge of Earl's Wetland with his hands in his jacket pockets. "But the data is clear. Tile drainage increases yield by 15 to 20%. You're leaving money in the ground." "Tile drainage moves water off the land," Earl said quietly. He was watching a pair of blue-winged teal circle the far end of the pothole. "Where does it move it to?" "Into the ditches, into the creeks, into the river. That's the system." "And when every farm in the county is moving water into the river at the same time," Earl said, still watching the teal, "where does the river move it to?" Dale didn't answer. It wasn't a question he had been trained to think about. "I'll tell you where," Earl said. "Onto somebody's field downstream, or back up through the tiles onto your own." Let me explain the science behind what Earl understood, because it's the foundation of this entire story. A prairie pothole wetland is, in the simplest terms, a natural bathtub. The depression holds water. The root systems of the cattails and sedges create a dense, sponge-like layer of organic soil that absorbs rainfall and releases it slowly, over days and weeks, not hours. 1 acre of healthy wetland can store between 1 and 1.5 million gallons of floodwater. Earl's 35 acres, at full capacity, could hold between 35 and 52 million gallons. Think of it this way. Imagine you're washing dishes and the water is running. If you have a sponge on the counter, the water hits the sponge, soaks in, and drips off slowly. Pull the sponge away, and the water runs straight off the counter onto the floor. Iowa pulled 95% of its sponges out between 1850 and 1980. 4 million acres of wetland drained for corn. Then it rained 48 inches in 5 months, and the water had nowhere to go but straight into the rivers. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service would later document that in watersheds where wetlands had been destroyed, flood peaks increased by as much as 80%. The water that used to sit in 10,000 shallow potholes across north-central Iowa, seeping slowly into the groundwater over weeks, was now being channeled through tile lines directly into streams and rivers within hours of falling. The drainage system didn't just move water off the farmland. It moved all the water off all the farmland at the same time. And that is how you build a flood. Earl hadn't read any of those studies. He didn't need to. He had a father who told him the water needed a place to rest, and 44 years of watching it prove his father right every single spring. Let me tell you about what happened in the first week of July 1993, because that's the scene I want you to see. The rain had been falling for weeks. Not dramatic rain, not the kind of thunderstorm that shakes the windows and moves on. This was the other kind, the patient kind. The kind that starts as a drizzle at 4 in the morning and is still drizzling at 4 in the afternoon and starts again at midnight. The kind that fills your boots before you notice your boots are wet. By July 5th, the ground in Kossuth County was saturated to a depth of 4 feet. The tile lines were running at full capacity. Every drainage ditch in the township was bank full. The East Fork of the Des Moines River was 3 feet above flood stage and still rising. Every farmer in the county had walked his fields that week and come back shaking his head. Every farmer had looked at the sky and said the same thing. It's got to stop sometime. Every farmer except Earl Dietrich. Earl didn't look at the sky. He looked at the pothole, and the pothole still had room. Then, on the night of July 8th, the sky opened. 5 inches of rain fell in 12 hours, not on dry ground, on ground that was already holding every drop it could hold. Earl stood at his kitchen window at 6 in the morning on July 9th, drinking coffee that June had made at 4:30, and watched. To the north, across County Road B63, Hank Schroeder's cornfield was pooling. Water stood in the rows between the corn, reflecting the gray sky like a broken mirror. The tile outlets at the edge of Hank's field were gurgling, pushing brown water into the ditch. But the ditch was already full. The water had nowhere to go. It was backing up, spreading across the field in a slow brown sheet. To the south, the same thing was happening on the Mueller place and the Jorgensen place. 320 acres of tile-drained cropland, designed to shed water as fast as possible, shedding it into a system that was already drowning. Earl looked east, toward his own low quarter. The 35 acres of prairie pothole were doing exactly what they had been doing for 10,000 years. The cattails were standing in 3 feet of water. The sedge meadow along the fringe was submerged. The surface was calm, not rushing, not sheeting, not cutting channels through topsoil, just sitting, holding, absorbing. The rain kept falling. On July 10th, another 7 inches. Hank Schroeder's field was under a foot of standing water. The corn was drowning. The tile lines had reversed. Instead of draining water out, they were channeling floodwater in from the backed-up ditches. Earl's pothole rose 14 inches. The cattails swayed. The red-winged blackbirds relocated to higher perches. But the water stayed in the basin. It didn't overflow. It didn't rush across Earl's cornfield. It sat there, doing exactly what Walter Dietrich said it would do 60 years ago. It was resting. Dale Pfeiffer drove out to Earl's place on the afternoon of July 12th. He was 67 years old now, retired from the extension office for 3 years, and his own 40 acres of garden and pasture south of Algona were under 6 inches of water. He parked at the end of Earl's driveway, and walked to where Earl was standing by the machine shed, watching the rain. "It's bad, Earl," Dale said. His voice was quieter than it used to be. "Hank's lost his whole corn crop. Mueller's the same. Jorgensen can't even get to his barn." Earl nodded. "Your fields they look all right," Dale said. There was something in his voice that wasn't quite a question, and wasn't quite an admission. "How are your fields still draining?" Earl looked at Dale for the first time. His eyes were calm. His face showed nothing but the patience of a man who had been waiting 25 years for someone to ask that question. "They're not draining, Dale," Earl said. "They're not draining because they don't need to drain. The water's sitting in the pothole. That's where it goes. That's where it's always gone." Dale looked out at the 35 acres of cattail and open water. The surface was smooth. The water was contained. On every other piece of land visible from where they stood, water was moving, sheeting, channeling, cutting, destroying. On Earl's 35 acres, it was still. "The swamp," Dale said quietly. "The swamp," Earl said. The rain continued through July. 20 days of measurable precipitation in a single month, against a normal average of 8 or 9. The kind of rain that doesn't make the national news for any single storm, but accumulates into something biblical. Let me tell you what those 35 acres did in July and August of 1993, because the numbers are the performance, and the performance is the proof. On July 9th, after the first 5-inch deluge, the pothole absorbed the runoff from approximately 80 acres of Earl's upland fields. Water that would have sheeted across his cropland and into the drainage ditch flowed downhill into the natural depression and stopped. The water level in the pothole rose 8 inches. On July 10th, after another 7 inches of rain, the pothole rose 14 more inches. The total depth was now just under 4 feet, near capacity, but still below the rim of the natural basin. Hank Schroeder's field, 1/4 mile north, was under 18 inches of standing water. His tile lines were pushing water up through the soil instead of pulling it down. His corn was dying. For a moment, on the morning of July 11th, nothing seemed to happen. The rain had paused. A thin gray light filtered through the overcast. Earl stood at the edge of the pothole in rubber boots that came up to his knees, watching the surface. It was still. Not the stillness of a puddle on concrete, the stillness of something alive, something working beneath the surface where you couldn't see it. Then the pothole began to do something that no tile drainage system could do. It began to release water downward, slowly, through the organic soil layer, into the shallow groundwater table. Not through pipes, not through ditches, through 6 inches of root mass and decomposed plant material that had been filtering water for 10,000 years. The release rate was measured not in gallons per minute, but in gallons per day. While tile-drained fields were channeling thousands of gallons per hour into already overloaded streams, Earl's wetland was releasing water at a pace that the watershed could absorb. The sponge was doing what sponges do. It was holding, then releasing, then holding again. On July 13th, the rain came back. 4 more inches in 36 hours. Across Kossuth County, the damage accelerated. The East Fork of the Des Moines River reached a level that hadn't been recorded since monitoring began. Emergency management teams drove through the township, marking roads that were no longer passable. Earl's pothole rose another 6 inches. The water was now less than 8 inches from the basin rim. If it overflowed, the runoff would cross his corn ground and join the flood. For the first time in the entire event, Earl felt something tighten in his chest. But the cattail roots held. The sedge mat absorbed. The 10,000-year-old layer of organic muck did what 10,000 years had designed it to do. It drank, slowly, steadily, pulling water down through a structure so fine and so complex that no engineer could replicate it. The pothole did not overflow. On July 15th, Hank Schroeder's field was under 2 feet of water. The corn was dead. 3 miles south, the Mueller family had evacuated their farmhouse. The river was 9 feet above flood stage. Earl's upland fields were wet. The soil was saturated. But the water was not standing. It was moving, slowly, by gravity, into the 35-acre depression that everyone had laughed about for 25 years. And the depression was holding it. Every gallon that the pothole held was a gallon that did not reach the East Fork of the Des Moines River. Every gallon it absorbed was a gallon that did not flood Hank Schroeder's field, or wash out the Mueller driveway, or add another inch to the river gauge in Fort Dodge. By August 1st, the Mississippi River at St. Louis had crested at 49.6 feet, nearly 20 feet above flood stage, the highest level ever recorded in 228 years of record keeping. 15 million acres of farmland across 9 states were underwater. Earl Dietrich stood at the edge of his pothole and watched the water. The cattails were submerged to their tips. The red-winged blackbirds were gone. The surface was dark and still. But his cornfield was not underwater. His soybeans were not floating. His driveway was not washed out. His well was not contaminated. Every farm in the township had filed for federal disaster assistance by the end of July. Every farm had reported crop losses exceeding 70%. Every farm except Earl Dietrich's. His face was calm, but there was something in his eyes. The quiet satisfaction of a man whose father had told him something true, and who had believed it long enough to see it proven. Nobody drove past Earl's place that week without slowing down. Nobody pointed at the swamp. Nobody said, "Mud duck." The laughter had stopped. Let me tell you about what happened in September and October of 1993, because that's the part most people never hear. The numbers are the proof, and the proof is why this story exists. Earl Dietrich harvested his corn in October of 1993. His 285 acres of cropland, the land surrounding the pothole, the land that the pothole had protected, yielded 118 bushels per acre. Not his best year. The saturated soil and limited sunlight had cost him 20 bushels from his normal average. But he harvested. Hank Schroeder, who had drained his potholes in 1964 and gained 40 acres of corn ground, harvested 0 bushels in 1993. His fields were underwater from July 9th through September 28th. The corn was dead. The soybeans were dead. 82 days of standing water had killed everything above and below the soil line. The Mueller family, who had drained 60 acres of wetland in 1959 and turned it into some of the highest yielding land in the township, harvested 0 bushels. Their fields did not dry enough to drive a combine on until the 3rd week of October. and by then, there was nothing left to combine. The Jorgensen operation, 480 acres, fully tile-drained, financed with a $340,000 operating loan from Farm Credit Services, harvested 11 bushels per acre on the portions of land that were above the flood line. The rest was gone. The Jorgensens would spend the winter filing insurance claims and renegotiating debt. Earl's total crop income for 1993, approximately $89,000 in corn and soybean sales, against operating costs of roughly $31,000. He cleared $58,000. He owed nothing to any bank. He paid cash for next year's seed before Thanksgiving. His three nearest neighbors' combined crop income for 1993, zero. Their combined debt entering the winter, over $400,000 in operating loans, equipment payments, and tile drainage repair costs. Hank Schroeder would spend $14,000 replacing tile lines that the flood had crushed and silted shut. The Muellers would spend $22,000. The Jorgensens would spend the winter on the phone with Farm Credit Services, trying to restructure a debt that was growing faster than any crop they would ever plant. Think about the cost of draining those wetlands, because the numbers tell you everything about the difference between price and value. The farmers of Kossuth County had spent, collectively, millions of dollars over 40 years to drain every pothole, every slough, every low spot that held water. They had turned wetland into cropland. They had increased their plantable acres. They had raised their yields in every normal year. But 1993 was not a normal year. And in 1993, every dollar they had spent on drainage worked against them. Every tile line they had installed became a conduit for floodwater. Every pothole they had drained was an empty bathtub that couldn't hold a single gallon when the rain wouldn't stop. The investment that had made them more productive in average years made them more vulnerable in the year that mattered most. Dale Pfeiffer drove out to Earl's place on a Saturday morning in late October. He drove slowly. He wasn't in a hurry to get where he was going. He had thought about what he'd said at the co-op meeting in 1968. He had thought about the word museum. He had thought about 25 years of drainage recommendations and cost share applications and yield projections that had never included a line item for what happens when the water has nowhere left to go. He pulled into Earl's driveway and stopped. The 35 acres of pothole were directly in front of him. The water level had dropped 2 feet since August. The cattails were recovering. A pair of mallards paddled across the far end. Dale got out and found Earl in the machine shed changing the oil on the 6600 combine. "My well's bad," Dale said. "Floodwater got into the aquifer. County Health says don't drink it until they test it again in December." Earl wiped his hands on a rag and looked at Dale. "You can fill up from my well," Earl said. "Bring jugs. Come any time." He didn't say anything else. He didn't say, "I told you so." He didn't mention the co-op meeting or the nickname or the 25 years of jokes. He just pointed to the spigot on the east side of the barn and went back to the oil change. Dale filled 4 5-gallon jugs and loaded them into his truck. Before he left, he stood for a moment and looked at the pothole. "Your daddy was right about the water," Dale said. Earl didn't look up from the combine. "He usually was," Earl said. The following spring, the Iowa legislature would begin discussing wetland restoration programs. The federal government would expand the Wetlands Reserve Program. Scientists would publish papers showing that the destruction of prairie potholes across the upper Midwest had amplified the 1993 flood by removing millions of acres of natural water storage from the landscape. None of those papers mentioned Earl Dietrich. None of them mentioned a 72-year-old farmer in Kossuth County who had turned down free government money to keep a swamp because his father told him the water needed a place to rest. But the swamp is still there. So is the farm. This story draws from real agricultural and environmental history of wetland drainage policy in the American Midwest. The USDA cost-share drainage programs of the 1950s through 1970s and the Great Flood of 1993. Characters and dialogue are dramatized for storytelling. Did your grandfather ever keep a piece of land that everyone told him to plow over? A wet corner, a creek bottom, a marshy spot he just left alone? Tell us in the comments.